Hey, Presence TV. I'm Ryan Smith, and we are in an incredibly fortunate position today because we're chatting with Pastor Jentezen Franklin all the way from the United States. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
It's exciting stuff.
Yeah, big conference.
Well, we were just chatting before, and we're going to pick up from what we were talking about before because it's way too much of a hot topic. It's a real cliffhanger that you, in fact, studied jazz before you went into the ministry.
That's right.
Tell us a bit about that and just your father's encouragement and so on.
Yeah, well, my mother was pretty amazing. She had 5 kids, and my father was a pastor, but my mother kind of ran the house. And she said all of her children had to learn to play an instrument. And so all the kids, one of my sisters played the piano, and one trumpet, trombone, and another one played the trumpet, and so I wanted to be different, and so I went with the sax.
With the sax?
Yeah, and so to make a long story short, yeah, my senior year, I got a full scholarship to go to college and study jazz and music. I love music, always loved music. I play keyboards and play sax was my main instrument, alto sax, tenor sax, and so, that's what we did. Being from the South and in the United States, the blues and all of that, it's a big part of the culture. So I'd heard it all of my life and could play a lot, just ad-libbing, but thoroughly enjoyed play. Still do to this day. It's a great expression and part of who I am.
And you're known to sneak out from time to time and play in the jazz clubs and when no one's looking?
I have. Also,
really?
just sometimes getting with some of the church musicians, man. The church musicians now, back in the day when I was coming up, they weren't on the level. Some of these guys can play. We got a church in Southern California, and a lot of the guys in the band actually, they're professional musicians. One guy, he is the music director for J-Lo.
Is that right?
And yeah, and so he's there when he's not on tour. And so you get with a bunch of guys like that, and they love the Lord with all of their heart, and you can play. I could play all night with them. It's just amazing.
Now tell me something. You were born in North Carolina, but you're based in Gainesville, in Georgia, where Free Chapel is.
That's right.
Must have a heart for the South, huh? That's
yeah,
where your roots are. Tell me a bit about Free Chapel and just the journey of the church. I'd love to hear a bit about it.
It's kind of neat. I was an evangelist, and I got married to my wife when I was 25, and we would go to this church, this independent church, ran about 250 people, and we would go preach there once a year. And my wife's grandmother attended this church, and so the pastor booked me 9 months in advance to come do a big anniversary celebration. And on the weekend that he died, he was an elderly man, he died on Friday night, and I was scheduled to come in and preach that Sunday morning, which was the day of his funeral. And they asked me to keep, I tried to get out of it, and they said, no, we want you to come. Our church is brokenhearted. He's the only pastor we've had. You've preached here many times. We love you. Come on. And so I get up and I preach that Sunday morning. As soon as the service was over, they brought the casket in with the pastor and had the funeral. And I heard in my spirit the Lord say to me in that moment, they're sheep without a shepherd, and I'm calling you to be their shepherd. And I kind of hid it in my heart like Mary, and didn't want to say anything because I really didn't want a pastor. I really enjoyed evangelizing. But after a while, they called, and before we knew it, we were there. I'd never pastored a church before, and it's exploded. It's been an amazing journey. We've watched God do some pretty amazing things there.
How long ago was that?
About 25 years.
Good heavens. And tell me something. Your dad was a huge encouragement to you.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that relationship with your father in terms of his encouragement concerning what you would spend your life pursuing.
Yeah, my dad was a preacher, but he never wanted to put any expectation on me or any of his kids that we had to go into ministry. He felt like if God didn't call you, you didn't need to do it, And he used to tell me, he would say, there's one way you know that you're called, and it's simply this: if you can do anything else and feel like you're pleasing God and doing what you were created to do, you should do it. You should do it. But if you can't, then you're surely called, and you need to preach.
My goodness.
And I reached that point in my life in my second year of college when I was studying music and really enjoy what I was doing, but there was this dissatisfaction that I knew. I'd see my brother preach, and I'd see other preachers preach, and I would hear that voice on the inside saying, "You must do that. You must do that." But I was terrified, terrified of crowds, terrified of, now put a musical instrument in my hand and I'll put on a show. But you know, to get up and communicate and speak and talk, it was terrifying to me, and really wanted to run from that.
It's extraordinary that to have grown up in a family with such freedom,
Yeah,
with parents giving
Yeah.
you incredible liberty to not only make those decisions for yourself, but without the pressure.
yeah,
It must have been incredibly freeing and
Yeah, it was.
liberating to not feel it pushed onto you.
yeah. I think there's so much wisdom in that. You know, when you go ahead and try to live your life through your kids, it never works out good. You know, a lot of parents are trying to want their kids to do everything they didn't do.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful, you put expectations on them that God hasn't put on them. But I never felt that pressure. I watched my father, and he's gone to be with the Lord, but he was a magnificent preacher, powerful preacher.
Wow.
And to this day, I remember his sermons, and and have a lot of them, and have preached a lot of them, because he was just such a magnificent communicator. And so it impacted my life. And somebody said ministry isn't just taught, it's caught.
Yes.
And I caught it through my dad.
Tell me something, like the ministry over these last 25 years
Yeah.
is incredibly fruitful, right? I mean, you're not just an author, you're a television host, you've been involved in outreach and missions, and it sounds like it's just gone from strength to strength. Tell us a bit about some of those initiatives and the journey. I'd love to hear about some of the journey in terms of resistance and growth and
Right.
discipleship into maturity, and particularly the initiative of Freedom House. Tell me a bit about all that.
Well, you know, our church is about 40 miles north of Atlanta. Atlanta's a major city in America, but where we are is a little more country, a little more suburb, and so nobody had really heard of Gainesville. It's on a large lake, and our church is on a lake, and I live on a lake, and it's just water. It's just, you know, and that's what it's known for. But the church just began to explode, and people began to come, and we now have 6 campuses, and we did go on television. It's a pretty amazing thing, pretty amazing story with that. The first time that I was on Christian television was on TBN Network.
Oh, really?
And they asked me to play my sax. I was known more as a musician. I was pastoring, the church was small, and Jan Crouch heard me play the sax and invited me to come play the saxophone.
Wow.
That night, they picked us up from the hotel that I'd flown into in Dallas, Texas, and there was a young preacher there who had never been on TBN, so I'd never been on TBN, and this young preacher had never been on TBN. His name was T.D. Jakes.
My goodness.
And so we rode over in the car together. We're friends, and I love him and honor him. And he was as nervous as he could be, and I was as nervous as I could be. And that night was a pretty special night because it opened a lot of doors. And the first time that I preached on TBN was an accident.
Really?
Yeah. They would book me over and over to come play my sax. And one night, they used to do the show live, and this was a national television. It was a big deal, particularly back then. It was live, and it was a big audience with that show every night. And one of the speakers got sick and could not preach, and they didn't have anybody else to preach. And so the director comes over during the live show and said he's too sick. He's a famous preacher, very famous preacher. And they said, he's too sick to preach. Can you preach? And I was there doing my
Doing the saxophone. Did you play as well?
Yeah, I
as
played.
double dipping.
And
Sounds
then I
got-
walked out and I preached, you know, and I didn't have my Bible. I didn't have nothing. They said, here's a microphone.
Good heavens.
And so I preached, and that opened the door. You know, God, Jan saw it, and some other people with TBN saw it, and the next thing I knew, I was invited to have a program on the network. And
Is that right?
That kind of launched us. So it's kind of supernatural the way God did that.
With the outreach since then, though, I mean, the missions and the outreach, and particularly Freedom House, has that been it's how it's germinated since then and evolved.
Yeah.
Has the TV been like a sort of a catalyst?
Yeah.
A launch pad to
Yeah,
that?
it really has. It's, you know, we from that began to do some conferences that really took off. We did a youth conference, and we do it every year at the Gwinnett Arena, seats 14,000, and it sells out about a month in advance every year. And then we do marriage conferences and women's conferences, and it's all directly result of the television ministry getting out there.
Extraordinary. Now listen, I'm holding in my hand a ticking time bomb.
Yeah.
Ding dong. Look at this. This is your new book, Love Like You've Never Been Hurt. That's a pretty audacious title.
Yeah.
Love Like You've Never Been Hurt. Easier said than done. So, do you mind if we talk a bit about this?
Not at all.
Talk to me about the golden thread. Like, what's the inspiration behind writing something like that?
Well, my wife and I have been married 30 years. We have 5 kids, and we've raised 5 teenagers. And with that, 4 beautiful daughters and 1 son who is in college now. And with that comes those storms that come to every family, and I don't care what you do or how hard you try, there's going to come test, and the wind's going to blow against your house sooner or later.
Mm-hmm.
And we went through something as a family about 9 years ago that took us to the limit of you know, wondering, will we ever be whole again? Will God put our family back together again? I talk about it in the book. And I wrote the book with my wife. I hadn't written a book in 5 years, and we wrote, you know, some books, and they were New York Times bestsellers, but I just felt like I needed a break. And now I understand why. Because so many families are in trouble. So many people who have relatives who live across town, and something happened and we just don't speak anymore. We don't get along. They're not living like they ought to be living. Therefore, I'm pulling away from them, or I don't agree with their lifestyle. And so it's almost like it's a sickness in the body of Christ, that we don't know how to love one another. And in the middle of our crisis, when our family was broken, and when we went through something with one of our kids that just changed the dynamic of our family for about 3 years.
Gosh.
It's not a quick answer. It's not a quick thing. Sometimes there are things that happen that change everything.
Yeah.
But God makes all things new.
Yeah.
And I found out in the middle of that it takes the worst things done to you to bring out the best in you.
Huh. Say that again.
That when you know, New Zealand is you know, just a little ways away here, and your pastor is from New Zealand.
Yeah.
I was running there one time. I'm a runner, and I was preaching in New Zealand, and I was running, and I noticed there were little birds that I almost tripped over. And I asked somebody, and they said 41% of the birds in New Zealand can't fly. And it's because there are no predators on that island. And therefore, if there's no need to fly, they don't use their wings. All they have is little stubs.
Extraordinary.
And sometimes it takes the opposition. It takes the brokenness. It takes the pain. It takes the adversity. Sometimes it takes the worst things done to you to bring out the best in you. And when you go through offense and hurt and being broken, it's God wanting to bring the best out of you.
Yeah, naturally.
And forgiveness and healing is the best.
Yeah.
I'm 55 years old, and after we wrote the book, and
Well, you're looking deadly, but carry on.
thank you, but my wife and I went to a tattoo parlor. I've never had a tattoo in my body in my life. I'm too old for that stuff. But I've got a tattoo right here.
Get a close up on that, guys.
It says 70 times 7.
My goodness.
And one time Peter came to Jesus and he said, Lord, how many times do I have to forgive someone who's hurt me? And then he had his own answer, 7 times. And when he said 7 times, he really thought he was being generous. The Pharisees taught 3 times. So he just doubled it and added 1 and thought, I'm good.
Yeah.
And Jesus' answer floored him. Jesus said, not 7 times, but 70 times 7.
My goodness.
That's 490 times a day. That's 3 times every minute. In other words, forgiveness is not about keeping score. It's about losing count. That if you're going to live this amazing journey, and life is an adventure in forgiveness. The journey we're on, the number one battle for the believer is forgiveness and not being offended.
Yeah.
You're going to get hurt. Somebody's going to hurt you. Somebody's going to do something. Somebody's going to lie on you. Somebody's going to break your heart. We get along as long as we all agree on everything.
Yeah.
But what about when conflict comes to your house?
Yeah.
You have to go to that 70 times 7 club and remind yourself forgiveness is not about keeping score.
Sure.
You did this to me, now I'm adding that up. I'm adding it up. I can remember things, you know, that you did to me. It's not about keeping score. It's about losing count. And that's what Jesus does for us, by the way.
100%. I'm interested in what you said. Like, no one could have achieved what you've achieved in Christ without actually having to navigate those sorts of tests, the criticism test, the pride test,
That's right.
the betrayal test. I'm curious to know, tell us a bit about how you've combated that. How have you dealt with the resistance, the warfare, the attacks from darkness, these sorts of things? Because life will take you places you never thought you'd go, particularly in ministry. How have you managed?
Well, at some point when you get offended and when people hurt you, it's not about what they did. It's about your reaction. What happened to me and my wife in this book is the thing that moved me so greatly was one night the siblings were going at each other, at their sister, who they were so angry at, who had just gone down the wrong path and made some awful choices and gotten deep in bondage and sin. And they were so angry at her and I'll never forget, one of my daughters said to her sister that she was angry at, "I hate you because you've changed my dad." I was thinking she was the problem, but when I heard that, I realized I was the problem. That it had changed me, that
Wow.
being hurt and broken and offended and wounded had hurt me and changed me. And that's when this phrase, "love like you've never been hurt," came across my desk. And I began to preach on, you know, we've got to love like we've never been hurt. Joseph did. Joseph looked at the family members who had done him the worst and wrong, and he said, "You meant it for my evil, but God meant it for my good," and he loved like he'd never been hurt. Sometimes we got to love God like we've never been hurt.
And forgive him, even though he's got nothing to be forgiven for.
It's what Job had to do.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes the unexplainable absences of God. Where was he? Why did my child die in a car wreck? Why didn't he do something? Why didn't he heal my mother of cancer? And at some point, you have to get to that place that you say, "God, I may not understand you. I don't ever know that I'll ever understand this, but I'm going to love like I've never been hurt." And I'm going to tell you, when you do, it's the way he loves us. When we begin to love him and love one another, healing can come, miracles can come, blessings will come back into your life. It's a very, very important message.
Well, it sounds like thrilling content, and hopefully that
It's
continue
raw
to...
and it's real.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Has it been well received so far?
It really has. It's been amazing. It's been out about 6 weeks, and the people told me, our publisher told me, that they had sold over 75,000 copies in 6 weeks. It blows my mind.
Well, it's certainly a timely message. Can I just ask you in closing, another thing that you're well known for about having great revelation in, and it's been an effective part of your ministry, is this idea of fasting, which is possibly not another popular subject to emphasize. But tell us a little bit about the impact that fasting's had on your life, but also the revelation behind it.
Well, I was, the first book that I ever wrote actually was the fasting book. And the reason that I wrote it, actually it was the second book, but it was the first book that really got published in a big way. And the publisher didn't want to do a book on fasting. I'd signed a 3-book deal, and he said, and I said, "I want fasting in that." And he said, "Well, nobody wants to hear about it," but I insisted. And it's amazing, you know, that God took that message. Fasting has been a major part of my life. I was on a 3-day fast when God called me to preach.
Is that right?
Yeah. And you know, been on numerous fasts that just when I feel like I'm getting dull, when I feel like it's just becoming routine, when I feel like I've lost that edge, It's amazing if you'll just do a sun-up to sundown fast. It fine-tunes you. It opens your ears. It sharpens your spirit. It reignites your passion. Jesus did it. Moses did it. Paul did it. All of the major Bible characters from Elijah to you name it, Jeremiah, they all fasted.
Yeah.
And so we need to recapture that message, because what it does is it makes you tender again. It makes you open again to the things of God. We've got to stay open.
Yeah.
And there's nothing like fine-tuning your spirit with a day of fasting and prayer.
And there's a lot of rhythms to the kingdom that we can't afford to lose, can we?
No, that's
like
right.
Sabbath delight, but also fasting and prayer and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. You know, sometimes we just forget that there's something about sacrifice. There's something about saying, God, I'm willing to pay the price to draw closer to you. I want to break the norm. I want to come out of the routine of life. I don't want just normal days. You can't live like that, but there needs to be seasons where we set aside and we say, I'm going to fast these days and I'm going to seek your face. And I'm telling you, every time I fast, I get more of God's presence. And that's what makes it so addictive. It always works. It always brings you in to God's presence.
Pastor Jentezen Franklin, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honor. It's great to be with you guys.
We're
It's
looking forward to hearing
amazing
you at
what
the
God is
conference.
doing here.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.